Seminar on Self with your philosopher at large, Trista McGough. Today we're going to be considering the faculties of self-transformation, which are intelligence, sentience, conscience, and vivacience. However, before explaining any of these faculties, I'd like to broach three preparatory items. The first is the model I utilize for the description and explanation of my philosophy. The second is, what is my philosophy? And the third, which philosophical lineages, doctrines, and thinkers contributed to my system of thought? Firstly, I employ what is known as an Omniversal Model. It's actually a conceptual modeling system. And it is sort of similar to something that you might be familiar with from geology and architecture. There's something called Microcosmic Model, in which everything, like a mountaintop, goes from there and radiates from the point at the top along the sides to the bottom, like a cone. Or in architecture, you can think of a dome at the top of a cathedral. And the opposite of that is if you were to take that dome and reverse it so that it is concave, and you have a geological feature that's sweeping downward and inward to a central point, that's called centroclinal. Now I use what's called an Omniversal Model, or OM for short. And I begin with a point. And a point, as you know, in Euclidean geometry, has no dimension whatsoever. However, when there is a line, such as there is here with this radial vector, this line now has one dimension. It does have a magnitude, and here it does have a direction it is going in, either outward or back inward. There's a special radial vector that I refer to as the axis identity that binds this entire sphere. Imagine a sphere to this outer ring, and that's what the ring past knot is. It's a huge sphere. And the reason I use an omniversal model, because unlike geology or unlike architecture, this sphere, this circumference, has the potential to expand to infinity. Now, how do you capture visually something that has expanded to infinity along a radial vector of experience, such as you take hypothetical or theoretical absolute experience? So I utilize with just these various features, actually 5 if you include the faculties experience, which I've pointed out to you before, and if we were to look at those, we would see, of course, that I color code them, and we'll get into that in just a bit later. But essentially, all of this is just a graphic depiction of the same ideas. So the Omniversal Model starts with a point, and from it extend the radia, and each establish a common circumference. We talked about the comparable comparisons in geology and in architecture. However, now what I would like to do is point out that the infinity of the circumference is actually nothing more than the expression of the non-dimensionality and potential infinity of the point. And from this point can expand all potency through latency into patency, that is, into manifestation. So I use this rather innovative model for several reasons. One, it's because it's very simple in terms of using the categories. I can refer to something geometrically, and at the same time, we are understanding this is just a convention. Your consciousness is not an octahedron. However, the octahedron is probably the best figure that I've found. It's one of the Platonic solids, of course, the 5 solids, that represents everything, including the 5 various faculties we're going to speak of shortly. So, the reason I use this model is because of its explanative power. Sometimes it's called the Aeonal hypothesis because the Aeon is actually the One, and we will speak of this later on. And from the One emerges, but it's an emergence of itself from itself. This robust model, this model of Om, underlies Omnism as a robust theoretical model promising ultimate conceptual unification of philosophy and the sciences. Becomes attractive for several good model architectonic reasons. The first is simplicity. The OM uses the least number of categories, that is primary terms, as its axiomatic basis and theoretic vocabulary. Next is its completeness. Also, the OM is complete, its completeness. It can account for all possible, intelligible, conceivable, imagined, necessary, inferable, and actual categorical distinctions, derivations, combinations, and permutations, whether substance, field, structure, system, process, property, quality, function, idea, or any aspect of being. In a conceptually coherent, consistent, comprehensive, and complete theoretic architectonic of the entirety, the complete whole, without leaving out any possible parameter, such as exteriority or objectivity, interiority, subjectivity, or totality, which is interjectivity. We'll get to that later. Another, the OM model, is elegant. It's architectonically centered, conceptually symmetrical, and referentially isomorphic. I can use this as an explanative device in order to capture the various concepts and categories in other philosophies and explain them in a manner which compares them to other comparable philosophies and systems of thought, as well as, if you will, putting them through an alembic of logicism where they align with one another, sort of like a set of magnetic filings to a tuning fork. Also, there's another thing that commends the OM model, and that is its metacognivity. That is, it's verifiable through metacognition, that is, through your own self-reflection. You can decide for yourself what intuiting, willing, thinking, feeling, and doing are by your own self-referential experience. Also, the applicability. The OM can be applied to every personal, noetic, institutional, and historical occasion. In other words, it can be used as a way to organize one's view of the world. And it can be used for guidance. The Omniversal Model can form the axial architectonic around which to orient conscious evolution and self-transformation. And this last point on guidance is pivotal for my philosophy, which is founded on the self-transformative evolution of consciousness in the cosmos. As a philosopher, I am concerned with the one and only, all and everything of being, non-being, and conscious being. Or in other terms, I'm philosophically concerned with anything that is something. This is, for all intents, a definition of the cosmos with a capital K, which includes not only this actual world, of which we are an integral part, and which science studies, but every possible world. This universe, as well as any multi-universes, constitutive of being, non-being, and conscious being. For short, I call the cosmos the One. In common parlance, and for the philosophically inclined, I call it the Aeon, which shows my Neoplatonist roots, because it means the same thing, which we can also call the One Self. For it is the ontological intersection, as it were, of being, non-being, and conscious being. In session 9, we'll delve into the nature of reality as a blend of being, non-being, and conscious being. This all-embracing view of philosophy, which I've just articulated, I call Omniphilosophy. As an Omniphilosopher, I take a threefold view of philosophy as a human enterprise. The theoretic component that synthesizes the set of shared perspectives, common doctrines, and commensurable tenets as historically espoused by philosophers, thinkers, and system builders from both the East and the West, I call Omniversalism. Then there is the practical component that uses the three functions of philosophy. The critical function of philosophy analyzes ideas and propositions of doctrines for their truth and validity. The architectonic function builds a consistent and coherent worldview, that is, a big picture of the cosmos. The third function, the palingenetic function, is the yogic, that is, the systematic transformation of one's consciousness through self-realization and self-cultivation. This is Omniterics. The last component, Omnilectics, is one's creative output, whether an unwritten, unrecorded transaction that is nonetheless a conscious transaction, or a great project or masterpiece of art or some other thing that results in a product. Not everyone is inclined to philosophic thinking and talking, as am I. There are different paths that lead to the same mountain, and that's important to understand in this expanded view of omnism. There are 7 paths that lead to eudaimonia. Some of you may be familiar with Raja Yoga, and I place it here at the center as well as Bodhyanga. These are Indian terms. And Raja Yoga is the kingly yoga, and that is actually of 8 limbs. And it takes you through everything from your moral virtues, 10 moral virtues, through asanas and your posture, through pranayama, which has to do with your regulated breathing and controlled breathing. And then pratyahara, which has to do with sense withdrawal. You close down all senses, all 10 of the biotic senses. And then after that, you entered dharana, which is concentration. And you keep your mind attentive to one object and fixed through will and through concentration. And then there's dhyana, which is meditation, and that's where your mind ascends along a pathway of bliss, as it were, through the various cognitive dimensions of realization, in which you are dealing with higher and higher forms of eidetic energy, if you will. Higher forms of your own consciousness and realization. And the last is samadhi, where your mind is completely merged with the object of your contemplation, which in the Vedantic tradition and the Traika, Shaiva, Shakti, Shiva tradition is actually oneself. So you enter into a meditative state, and Raja Yoga is the principal path that takes you along to that state of enosis or oneness. Bodhyanga is the 7 factors to awakening in Buddhism, and it begins first of all with mindfulness, and next it's, I call it Dharma Dhyanoya. Dharma Dhyanoya is when you're always paying attention to reality, you're inspecting it, you're conscious of what you're doing, and you're conscious of your inspection. So that's the second feature of Bodhyanga. The third is energy or effort, and then the fourth is your sense of rapture, where everything is working together. Your voice, your feelings, your mind, your body, the rhythms of your breathing, your heart, it all is working together, and that's rapture. And then there's tranquility, which is the serenity of body and mind. And the sixth part of Bodhyanga is concentration, and the last is equanimity, which is an even-mindedness towards all things. Well, as you can tell, I've placed that at the center because it leads to this state of eudaimonia, this happiness we've spoken of. And you'll notice that on each of the faculties, which I've now indicated here, these 4 in particular that relate to will, and Agni Yoga, enlightenment, and this is the mind, the thinking element, and that's Gnana Yoga, philosophic yoga, and that's my principal path, as you can well understand. And then the path of endearment, or Bhakti Yoga, devotional yoga. The technique that's primarily used there is called Vairanya, which is another word for dispassion or detachment. So Vairanya is a technique that's used there like viveka, or discrimination here, or discernment, logical discernment through inference and conceptualization. And sankalpa is setting the will, and that's for Agni Yoga, which leads to empowerment, and Laya Yoga. There are all kinds of Laya Yogas. There's Kriya Yoga, Kundalini Yoga, and other forms of power yoga, which release and focus actually on the subtler bodies and releasing the energy thereof. And so Abhyasha, which is practice, is the technique that you want to use for finalizing your emancipation through Laya Yoga. And the highest yoga is Anuttara Tantra Yoga, and that leads to a sense of enosis, Kattva, which is oneness of oneself with everything else. As Plotinus used to describe it, it is the flight of the alone, small a, to the alone, capital A. So these are various forms of yoga, but the 7th type actually we all practice. It's karma yoga. It leads to vibhuti, that is to powers. These are not a special psychic powers necessarily. They're professional powers, they're practical powers, cognitive powers, social powers. All the powers that you have, that you've developed as capabilities in this empirical world. So, glad we looked at that briefly. Do not be hung up with the idea that you have to follow one particular path in order to achieve your various emancipations, because we will all practice all the paths. Some of us will focus as a principal path, such as myself, as a jnana yogi, but there are others who focus on some of the other paths. All right, so that said, whether you're a philosopher or not, you need to be a critical thinker, as I've just pointed out, through the various paths, and develop a clear understanding of the world around you and your world within you. Those who share a similar view of this worldview, though perhaps not as sharply articulated our mind are known by many names, including holists, or universalists, or cosmists, sometimes panentheists, maybe even absolutists. Whether they approach the one self through science, religion, art, or philosophy, they're looking at the big picture of the cosmos. We're all of one ilk. We are omnis. Omnism being the view of the whole in all of its unity and uniqueness. So much for my philosophy in general. As for my influences, these are very many and very diverse, calling upon thought traditions and preeminent thinkers from around the world and throughout history, as well as initiation into several lineages. The one that is most relevant now can be elucidated by consideration of the color scheme that I use for my depictions of consciousness. So let's look at this graphic of consciousness of self, and you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. These are 4 bright colors, primary colors, and of course they appear throughout the world's cultures. However, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have a special significance. And here you see one of my lineages, which is the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism, which is a form of Madhyamaka, or middle way Buddhism, which is a type of Mahayana, or Great Vehicle Buddhism, which is very comprehensive and systematic. However, that's from where I derive the colors. So you begin at the center, and that is Vairocana, and this is the all-accommodating, all-inclusive consciousness of self, directly intuiting itself. The green represents Amaga City, of the almighty, all-powerful, all-accomplishing consciousness of will. The blue is representative of what is known as the Dhyani Buddha, the meditative Buddha, Akshobhya, who is the immovable, all-mirroring, all-reflecting consciousness of mind. Yellow is representative of Ratnasambhava, the precious, all-embracing, all-endearing consciousness of love. And red is Amitabha, the all-discerning, all-achieving consciousness of life. That self-consciousness, the white from the center, of course, extends through enlightenment and endearment and empowerment and emancipation to the perimeters, eventually illuminating the entire bulb. All right. Now, I consistently employed this color scheme throughout my modeling of the Omniverse, as with, of course, today's theme, the faculties of experience. And you'll notice that I have these faculties color-coded, so green for conscience and will, intelligence, of course, relating to the blue of mind, Ratnasambhavas, yellow, precious, endearing, sentience, feeling realm, and vivacience, life, doing, action, vitality and vivacity, the power of life. This is all part of self-experiencing. However, this is where I employ this octahedron, which you can see limed here in blue, in order to give structure and a systematic way to describe the interaction of these 4 faculties as they revolve around the intuiting faculty of self-experiencing. It allows me as well to establish the self-experiencer. That is, so we have experiencer, experiencing, and the experienced. Here, the experienced self. And That will break these three divisions into what I call is the Trigonic Self, which you will know from many terms throughout your studies, either in theology or philosophy or any of the other kind of exposures that you've had. So there's the Aeonic or spiritual self, often referred to in Christianity as well as Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and Islam as spirit, and also in the Greek as pneuma. Now that is balanced by the psyche and the soul, which is your epistic or solar self, and you have an empiric or somatic self, which is your soma or personality. That's the experience self. So these three selves, the self-experiencer, self-experiencing, and the experienced self are but aspects of one great experience. Remember our formula of experience, that experience is constituted of an experiencer, the experienced, and the actual experiencing. These three aspects of the self, the Trigonic Self, leads to a consideration of each of us as an individual self, which we term the microcosmic self, because the microcosm, each of us as an individual, is the entire universe, consisting in our own individualized form. I represent the entire universe as omniscience. I represent the outer manifestation that is filtered, if you will, through us in our three selves as existence. So existence is omniscience turned inside out. Omniscience is existence turned back inside to itself. All focusing in a point. And that's the marvelous thing about a dimensionless point. Of course, it can appear anywhere. So it can appear at the top, it can appear at the bottom, it can appear anywhere throughout, which of course leads us to the definition of what the one is. And there's no better definition than I've ever found, than Rabelais gives in Pantagruel and Gargantuan, where he says, and he's speaking of God here, and he says, God is like an infinite intellectual sphere with its circumference nowhere and its center everywhere. Now, if you visualize a sphere where every occupied point is a center, and that there is no circumference, then you have the flexibility of the Omniversal Model, and at least conceptually comprehending and even going a long way toward imaginatively apprehending what the nature of the one is. But as a microcosmic self, we have three selves: the Aeonic self, the empiric self, and what I represent as the field of play in consciousness, your epistemic self. All right, now, or the epistic self. This is also what people refer to as the soul of the psyche. Some people have even called it grouped together the mind, right? It's all your internal organs of perception. It has to do with your sense of I-ness, and we'll break that down in a bit. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to each of these, but this is just the overall presentation so that you can see that they are interdependent and working with one another. And the way I'm going to be able to explain the faculties is by referring to the interaction of the epistemic self actually as it increases and expands its ability to, if you will, bridge the gap between omniscience and existence, which is what each of us are doing as a transfinity. This is infinity. This is finitude or finity. This is the area of transfinity. What is transfinity? Well, the mathematician Gregor Cantor pointed out that a trans-finite number is one such as this. All right, let's take all the whole numbers from 1 to infinity. Now, let's just take a look at all the even whole numbers from 2 through infinity. You see, that's actually a subset of the greater set of all whole numbers going to infinity. Likewise, each of us is like a set of prime numbers or a set of even-numbered integers or odd-number integers that are running on to infinity. However, we're part of the greater infinity. But as a transfinity, we partake of the finite nature of this world, plus the infinite potency of the Aeonic world, which here I've represented as pneuma, spirit, or the Aeonic or Gnostic self. So you have the Aeonic self represented by all the higher potentialities of the human being. You have, and this is, of course, as a microcosmic model, it will apply to any living creature in proportion to their degree of conscious evolution, in proportion. And here you see another one of my lineages and the traditions that I've studied, St. Thomas Aquinas and Thomism, and the idea of the law of proportionality. So an animal, and even a plant, and even a mineral, all of this would apply to in proportion to their state of being as a consciousness. But anyway, the higher potentials are in the Aeonic self. What eventually gets manifested as patencies are the empiric self, your personhood, your everyday personhood, and your inner world, your epistic self, your psyche, your soul, where the 5 faculties exist of intuiting, willing, thinking, feeling, and doing, or living. All of these exist internally, having, of course, internal causation, immanent activity. You cause your own mental effects. And that's what I'm referring to as the transfinite world. However, these 3 aspects of oneself are determined and regulated by 3 principles in an overarching fourth. Of course, I'm tying this together. It isn't just haphazard why you have 3 great sets of selves or vehicles. But you do so because of certain principles. And these principles here for the empiric self, and we all know it, down here on the plane of manifest reality, where think of this world in terms of its 3 dimensions, as well as all the vitality, as well as all the emotions, and your concrete thoughts. That's all that goes into the empiric self. We'll be talking about that in a moment. That all fosters existential integration under the principle of utility. The reason that we have the select senses that we do as human beings, and seeing only a small portion of the full electromagnetic spectrum with the retinas of our eyes, all of that specificity has a purpose. It's useful. It has a function in this world. And that's part of what's meant by the survival of the fittest. It's what elements fit the best into this world in order to promote its usefulness. Principle of utility rules over the empiric self, just like the principle of felicity or harmony, bliss, rules over the interpsychic domain, the domain of the soul. Here it optimizes self-transformation as well as intersubjective evolution. Yes, what we think influences everyone around us. what we feel and will and do impacts everyone around us in unseen dimensions, beyond just the physical dimension, beyond just the emotional dimension, beyond just the intellectual or lower concrete mind directions and dimensions. We influence one another intersubjectively all the time. You may find yourself keying into ideas and you wonder why in the world you are thinking such a thing, or how in the world you have grasped a particular concept or have a particular experience or feeling, or for that matter, impulse to do something. You are not alone. We have never been alone. We have an epistic self which, in Leibnizian terms, has a pre-established harmony. It's part of the balance that is manifested in this outer world. It's dependent on the principle of harmony. Utility is regulated by felicity. But the principle of unity unifies both felicity and utility at a universal level on the ground of consciousness. That's where I refer to the Aeonic self, which means union. And therefore, in terms of the final principle, which overarches all the others and unites them, synergizes them as three regulating principles operating the Trigonic self, is the principle of perfectibility. All right, now with these three divisions in mind, let's delve into what constitutes the Trigonic self. I want to point out to you that when we were talking about the empiric self and its 10 dimensions, we were talking about the 10 dimensions, remember, of the living self, the perspectival self, the feeling self, etc. These are all aspects of the soul working through the existence of the body, its anchor point. And I referred to that. Here's the center point of consciousness from which everything emerges. However, when we are looking in terms of dimensionalized being and the very many states of matter, the difference between, for instance, the solidity of three-dimensional matter and the fluidity of three-dimensional matter that's flowing as liquid, and then the, if you will, the areaform nature of three-dimensional matter as it vaporizes into the atmosphere, and then in the fourth state of matter is plasma, such as in lightning. All these so-called states of matter are all the material realm. Beyond that we experience is another realm, which is more subtle, just as material, but more subtle in terms of the grades of matter. And that's what's accounted for in terms of, if you will, this axial line. I can consider the various dimensions as we move up through the 10 dimensions, past the mere 3, up into the emotional realm, and then the mental realm, and then the intuitive Buddhic realm, and then the higher realm of pure will, etc. And we'll get into that much later on in terms of the basis of all of this. However, we're dealing with the faculties only at this moment. Well, you're going to notice that by now I use the word self in so many elastic and variegated ways that anyone who is familiar with Buddhism might question me as to its use and why I'm using that. After all, one of the 3 marks of existence that the Buddha outlined, besides ontological impermanence and existential suffering, was the essencelessness or lack of identity or emptiness of an enduring self. There is no permanent, fixed, unchanging soul, self, Atman, Purusha, spirit, Pneuma, whatever. that exists. I use the term self just because there is no single, enduring, unchanging entity for oneself. Rather, there are infinite dimensions in the one self, as there are a possibly infinity of expressions of every complex, ever-changing microcosmic self. The one self is infinitely diverse, yet ever a singularity, a unity regarding its manifestations. The omniscient transcendence of the one self is left undisturbed by its endless modifications and alterations as the existential eminence we experience as ourselves in the world. My affirmation of this also indicates my indebtedness to the lineage of the Indian omnist Shankaracharya, who systematized the system of Advaita Vedanta, which refers to the Aeon as, quote, one without a second, unquote. Now, I want to turn to something that's going to help elucidate that in terms of the faculties, processes, and states of consciousness. As I've spoke about before, there's the immanent activity that takes place within one's own psyche at this level of the epistic self. That's the experiencing. Now, there's either an inward pointing of consciousness, such as in meditation, or there's an outward pointing of consciousness, such as in everyday worldly affairs. One of the reasons that you want to insist after a while of allowing yourself time for silence, contemplation, prayer, and meditation is because that allows the natural inward pointing aspect of your consciousness to balance out what is otherwise, for most of us, the majority of time outward pointing consciousness. Another thing I wanted to point out here in the moment is that the agency of the watcher and the actor that represents the pure potentiality, if you will, of the microcosmic self becomes, through that inward and outward pointing, the watcher and the actor that is embodied in the existence that we have as the empiric self. The empiric self being the self that moves within this three-dimensional world along with feelings and our thoughts and our wills and all the activities in regards to that. Each of these, taking conscience, intelligence, vivacience, and sentience, those as the four main faculties of the experiencing self, I want to call attention simply to this. Let's begin with intelligence. We have a critical faculty of reason in which we think about the world, usually in a linear fashion, to arrive at some conclusion. Whether we arrive at that conclusion in an unmistaken way, or whether we arrive at it in a very mistaken and haphazard way, in which most of us don't check our facts, or most of us don't criticize the values we were taught to live by, it will eventually be distilled into something called the understanding. And the understanding is literally that. It's that which stands under your view of the world. So, everything that reason has considered in this world in one way or another ends up in being integrated in your system of understanding. Similarly, let's take a look at conscience in terms of your willpower. In terms of your willing, everything that's manifested through the personality, and that is whether it's by way of your actual intentions or your commitments, or by way of the vows that you take, whatever you do in your personality, giving your word in order to say that you will take whatever means is necessary to reach a goal, that is what your personae, that is the various roles that the personality takes to accomplish its ends, will develop. And similarly, as you develop that empirically in this world, that gets deposited into a structure, a moral structure, called your character. And the character is actually the field and the bonded field that holds your entire psyche together. It is, if you will, the crystallized and ever-expanding moral energy of your consciousness. And with Vivacience, that's your power, that's your inner life power, and in terms of your reservoir, if you will, that's your vitality. Your vivacity is at any given time the amount that you display. So vivacity has to do with intensity and quality and capacity of your manifest life, while vitality has to do with the hidden reservoir, your elan vital, something that is there for you to call upon. And you know, you have some days where you wake up and you go, boy, my energy level is really low. Well, your vivacience won't be very high because your vitality isn't very high that day. That all has to do with this vivacience power that we've been talking about here as life. And then, of course, there's sentience, the world of feeling as a faculty. And this is something, as through metacognition and your own self-reflection, you well know. You can feel something, no matter what you think about it, the feeling's not going to go away. And there are feelings you have that even though you will it to go away, that feeling won't go away. Well, your feelings, your sentiency, your sentience here is arranged along a polar scale from eros to agape. And agape, or some pronounce it agape, is the scale of your sense of empathy and all-inclusiveness toward others. That is, it is egoistical. The ego is transcended for the thou, for somebody else taken as a precious subject that you honor, love, and appreciate. And at the opposite end is eros. And eros is the appreciation you have for your body, your feelings, your thoughts. It's all the self-centeredness, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you realize that that is just one part of the teeter-totter that will go up and down in your life. And what you want to do is, as a healthy individual, is be able to realize that the delights you experience as eros in the world are delights that others have as well. And it becomes even more delightful when the two share that delight, and it becomes sympathetic, and it becomes a shared rejoicing. Well, I wanted to take a quick look at the nature of the Trigonic self here before we discuss the faculties of the self, the five faculties. So let's look at the three parts of the self, if you will, stratified. And let's begin with Pneuma. This is often referred to throughout other cultures, and here you'll see monad, atman, purusha, pneumic simplex. That is, it's the basis, the ground of everything. The plenic self, the divine self, the plethoric radix, the root, as opposed to the centrix, which is what this is, or the complex, the personal complex, which is what the empirical self is. This set of characteristics of the transcendental ego, where it is identity, unity, and totality, that's what marks the transcendent ego as opposed to the transcendental ego of the psyche, which is the epistemic structure and process that we all use as a subject, and we stand in contrast dualistically to an object, and we experience it, and that's what we're talking about in terms of experiencing. Of course, right here in the realm of the psyche, there's egoity, the I maker, ahamkara, in the Indian tradition it is called. It's the epistemic relation of subject-object we referred to. There's cycle agency, and that just means it's the liminal experiencing consciousness with the subliminal and supraliminal constructs. And remember, this is where you're surfing on the top of your consciousness. So right now it isn't as if you aren't operating in the Gnostic and epistic and empiric selves. You're operating all three. You're operating all three at once. As the experiencer that's part of a unified cosmos, you are operating as an Gnostic self that has total potentiality for infinite expansion. As a finite self, your empiric self is your person, and that's your arrangement of your ideas, your concrete thoughts, your self-identity down here, your everyday living, and your body, your 10 senses, the 5 active and the 5 passive, and that whole kit and caboodle. And that's all represented here as the empirical ego. And of course, now Freud speaks of it as the id with its eros, thanos, thanatos distinction, and the ego with its executive, adaptive, and repressive subsystems, and the superego, which has the ego ideal and, in his terms, his conscience. Well, this is, as a person, each of us are a personality. And the personality has all these various characteristics, including we have an experiential sensibility of, we have a limited agency, right? Time is sequential. We have a desire for one thing or another thing, but it's always bouncing back and forth. So it's always this limited attachment and craving going on. There's also limited knowledge. None of it, as Sophocles says, no man can know everything. And there's localized causality. If I knock over a glass, the water is going to spill localized here in the world, huh? It's not going to spread apart to Venus. All right. And then there are psychological capacities. We have the I-it distinction, which actually is a objective way that we refer to things around us. In fact, we even refer to some people. We go, well, you know, we objectify them. That's the term. In terms of feminist ideology, there's an objectification that takes place of someone, and you desubjectify them. Where up here, you realize that you have an I-thou relationship as a deixis. That is, as a self-experiencing person, you realize the qualitative difference when you are interacting with another person. The yogic secret of transformation into a sense of oneness has a lot to do with getting rid of this egocentric attachment to where you believe that only your own desires are of any interest to the omniverse. Anyway, we've spoken before. So there's your I-thou, the deixis. Poiesis. This term, theoria and praxis, come from Heidegger. And he speaks of these 3 life urges. And these actually are basics, or these are psychic capacities. These are actually part of the faculties that we're speaking of here. And the faculty of poiesis has to do with the creativity of will. Theoria has to do with the observational ability of the mind as it inspects the world and under the principle of correspondence attempts to ascertain its truth. Orexis is a term that I've employed in order to show the desire complex, where you have all your affections and your attachments, as well as your aversions to people, places, and things built up. And that, of course, relates to the feeling aspect, and that to sentience. And praxis relates to your vivacience, and that is doing, right? Okay. All right, now we've spoke of the experiential content, or noia, and each one of these are an aspect of noia, right? In terms of yourself, your intuitions, these are your deixia, your telia are your willings, your qualia are your feelings, your logia are your thoughts, and your vidya are the activities in your sense of vitality. It's any of your senses as they're feeding you stuff. And down here, the objective senses, the 5 passive and the 5 active, that we've often referred to, of course, are the manifestation with, behind them, the interjective senses of your own self-consciousness, your temporal consciousness, or sense of time, your entitative consciousness, that is your sense of what is real as real entities or things, entities, your entitative consciousness, your spatial consciousness, that is in terms of your 3 dimensions and any others, and your causal consciousness, that one thing causes another, that an event follows as an effect from a cause. So these are your interjective senses, and up here, in terms of the pneumic realm of your gnostic self, you have certain pure subjective senses. And we've talked of these before, your axiomatic, which are your foundational. They're the certainties that you rule your life by. I believe it is in Hebrews 11:1, Paul says, "For faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And that is exactly what is being referred to there. Our faith are the axioms by which you live. Now, your aretaic sense is your moral sense. It's your sense of ethical right and wrong. Your alethic sense is your sense of truth in the world, whether something corresponds and is a mistaken cognizance or whether it is a correct or valid cognizance of the world through mind. Your aesthetic sense leads to beauty and your appreciation of the beautiful, and that is, of course, related to sentience and the feeling realm. As the auctorial, which I otherwise refer to as the athenic, auctorial means that you're the author. You know that you're authoring your activities. I know I'm waving this, right? I know it's me doing that. All right. That's what I mean by the athenic or the auctorial sense. It's your sense of living power. You know what you're doing. Okay, so now that we've covered these very briefly, I could go down here and, of course, speak about the psychological capacities that fall out, which I should very quickly. All right, remember I referred to Heidegger's up here, the psychic capacities, poiesis, theoria, and praxis as relating to those faculties. Well, down here, so to speak, in terms of psychological capacities, here's your apodixis, and that's your sense of self that has actually come to some certainty in this world, or even if that certainty has led to your tolerance of ambiguity. And then there's technique, and technique is actually the techniques that you develop, your know-how that you develop through your poiesis, that is through your creative abilities. In the same way that orexis, that is your attachments and your aversions, eventually they become crystallized and manifest as philia, as love, and its various dimensions of repulsion as well as attraction. Sophos is the distillation or the knowledge that comes through theoria, that is a consideration of world. And here, Sophos is all sorts of knowledge and wisdoms that you have. It's your various intelligences, including your particular scientific discoveries and formulations. And then there's phronesis, which are your practical skills. It's, you know how to use your spoon and fork at a table, and you know how to use the shower, etc., etc. And there are personal capacities. Now, these are very important. These are in terms of the things that come from the center of yourself, that is from your intuition and from your discoveries thereof. You are going to have your self skills. And from your will, you'll develop your creative skills. And from your mind, there will be cognitive skills. And with your feelings, and remember that dimension of eros to agape, you are going to develop your social skills. Just as your pragmatic skills are going to be developed through your various praxis, that is your practices, your exertions, that are going to be developed into your practical wisdom or your know-how. These are going to become pragmatic skills, and that can be everything from tuning the guitar to playing the guitar to language skills and everything else that have a use in this world that is governed by the principle of utility, just like this is governed by the principle of felicity, and this by the principle of unity. So, that being said, I want to pass on quickly to the faculties of the self, and here once again we have our color code, and we have, beginning with intelligence, sentience, vivacience, and conscience, and here you'll notice my any of you who are familiar not only with the color scheme in Buddhism, you'll also notice that I divide things very much according to a Trika Advaita Shaivite system from Kashmir. And that's another of the major influences in my thinking. So you're going to see all 5 of these elements here involved with one another in the ways I've explained before. So let's take a look here at the various faculties. So let's take a look at the faculty of the faculty of self, the mode of consciousness, that we've spoke of as intuiting. Of course, your mode of consciousness under this faculty called conscience is willing. Under sentience, the mode of consciousness is feeling. Under intelligence, it's thinking. And under vivacience, it's doing. Now, the functions of consciousness I had previously outlined in one of these little graphics. And that is, of course, under the self, it's the watcher and the actor, right? It's outward energy and inward energy. And the character and personality under conscience, as well as agape and eros under sentience, understanding and reason under intelligence, and life, vitality, and vivacity under vivacience. Now, you'll notice that what I'm going to do is break the 3 parts of the Trigonic self into the infinite, transfinite, and finite. And here, if we're going to look under this Aeonic self, basically, we have here the axiomatics. That's your axiomatic sense. That's your sense of foundation, spiritually speaking. Your aretaic or moral sense is your sense of the good. And your aesthetic, as we explained, is the sense of beauty, as well as alethic is your sense of truth. And the authentic, or as I referred to before as the actorial, is your sense of power. Now, these are all infinite subjective sense that are subject to expansion. There is no limit on any of them. You can discover infinite truth. You can sense infinite beauty. You can have infinite goodness. You can exert infinite power, and you can discover the infinite foundations of your and all beings. There is no limit to these subjective senses. As for the epistic self and the transfinite interjective sensibilities, an interject is this. It's literally in between. the object and the subject. So when a subject, which is you, thinks about an apple, even just mentally, that mental picture of an apple becomes the object of your mentation. However, there is not just that object, and there is not just you, the subject, there is the interject, there is the experiencing, there is the you visualizing the apple, and that actual experience itself is the interject. And that's transfinite. That's a part of the infinite, but like a prime number, it's folded into a series that goes on and on and on and on and on forever. Now, we take a look at the transfinite sensibilities. There's a sense of self, that's your reflexive, and then there's a temporal, which is your sense of time. There's a sense of space, there's a sense of entity, and there's a sense of cause. And these forms of sensibility are inherent in the psyche. There are not just two, like Kant thought, a priori forms of intuition. There are not just two of those forms. There actually are four of them. Because you can't have space without entities in it, and you can't have time without there being some cause to affect the change in time. So all four of them coexist as a lattice, if you will, of psyche and sensibility. All right, then let's move on to the finite objective capabilities, and here we have our transformative skills that we've been working on, talking about, and which are the subject of yogic practitioners and anyone who has ever practiced any form of self-transformation at any time, anywhere, any place. These are your transformative skills related to yourself, but you have a whole set of creative skills, and that's everything from, you might be a virtuoso with some musical instrument, or perhaps you're an impresario and able to put together huge events with important people and all kinds of activities that lead to great entertainment. Or perhaps you're a sea captain and you have a whole set of creative skills in managing your crew. Well, you also have, as a sea captain, some social skills. You're going to have some cognitive skills, right? You're going to know how to navigate and maybe even use an astrolabe. And you're going to have practical skills. You'll probably know how to tie a few knots as well as how to wipe your chin after your next meal. Okay, so then I wanted to cover some sub-faculties that arise as forms of the self, and those are three basically, right? Memory that relates to past, imagination that relates to future, and your transforming consciousness that happens right here, right now. So there are 5 types of memory. There is, you're familiar with it, your episodic memory, right? You remember a particular place you were at, and perhaps maybe even what you ate. But you're not going to remember everything. That episode is very complex, and you're going to remember parts of it. However, you're going to have peculiar knowledge because you lived in that episode. Whatever it was, whatever activity, that's an episodic memory. It's different from a conceptual memory. Conceptual memory is where you know the difference between 2 and 4. And you know that 2 plus 2 is 4. That's all conceptual. And actually, that relates to the realm of touch and feeling and aesthesis. Semiotic memory is the memory of words and everything that words stand for and denote. So, semiotics refers to the meaning of words, that is their connotation. It refers to the denotation of words, that is their reference in the world. And it refers to their use, that is their pragmatic, how you use words. But it is different than conceptual memory. Think of conceiving a child. Conceiving a child, it takes 2 things, 2 sets of chromosomes coming together, right? And a zygote is formed. That is conception. And that's what I'm talking about here. This comes from the great pool of potential energy called archaeus. And we will deal with that at another time. However, your biographic memory, that's the memory that you put together. It's the story you tell yourself about your own personality and character. That's what it is. And your character and your personality often receive special treatment that you will give. And that's your biography. That's your autobiography. You're telling, in fact, that's your psycho-autobiography because it's internal to you. It's all in your own idiolect, that is your own private language, but you've built up your own biographic memory. The last is amneusis, which is a Greek word, and it means to remember, like when Plato talks about you remember ideas like 2 + 2 is 4, because actually you contemplated them in the epistemic realm or epistic realm of the soul before you were incarnated. That's another matter, but regardless, recognition. In terms of memory, remembering who you are at any given moment it is a recognition of your fundamental identity. However, in terms of imagination, you can identify with just about anyone or anything. Take a given movie. Very often you're going to identify with a lead character or a supporting character, or you'll meet somebody in life, you go, boy, I sure can identify with her or him. And that's all in your imagination. That's the imagination, though, related to yourself, just like the immersive imagination is when you actually become. That's like assuming a role like an actor. And you put yourself, you immerse yourself in the character of that individual. It may be different than your own character, but it's an immersive, imaginative experience. Just like empathetics, you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. You're not going to immerse yourself in their character. You're going to keep your own character, but you're going to empathize with somebody through imagination because you felt the same way at some time in your life. Speculative is what we'll call the scientific imagination. It's where they, meaning scientists, are theorizing in big ways about big ideas over the big picture. And it can be any of our speculative errands that we run in our mind as we are imagining things. And the last is dramatic, vivacious imagination. We're always rehearsing in our minds dramatic scenes of what we're going to do or how we would have rewritten scenes in the past of what we should have done, what would have been some dynamic, dramatic lines to deliver at the end of a denouement. Denouement. All right. Transforming consciousness takes us to the present, where I'm actually self-aware and I'm intuiting that denouement was mispronounced. But besides that, and that's part of my semiotic memory, right, and episodic memory, we're going to talk about the self-aware or intuiting. And here's where you use the awakening mantra, right? I am conscious of being conscious, right? That's the door. You step into that, and then you're aware, and you begin intuiting these other things. But here you're transforming consciousness. We talked about those techniques last time, right? A couple times ago. And that was deliberate willing, appreciative feeling, mindful thinking, and focused acting. So that was what we had presented back then. And that is the graph of the awakening consciousness. You begin with your reflective consciousness. I am conscious of being conscious. And from there, in the rest of your life, look for ways to deliberately will and mindfully think what you're doing at what given time. Appreciate and have an appreciative feeling for those around you and the beauties that exist, as well as focused acting, whether in the professionalism of your daily occupation or in the playfulness of your recreational activities. And these, of course, lead from the awakening consciousness to giving forth contributions to the world. And of course, you're going to notice here the archaic, alethic, axiomatic, authentic, and aesthetic senses. Those are your Gnostic senses. In other words, as you're turning on to your higher powers of consciousness, right, you're going to have certain contributions. Through your deliberate willing, you are going to yield goodness into the world. Through your mindful thinking, you are going to discover truth, and you are going to be an upholder of truth in the world. Through the aesthetic sense, you will discover the beauty, right, of appreciative feeling. Through appreciating the things around you and that appreciative feeling, you'll discover beauty through your aesthetic sense. In the same way that your authentic sense, your auctorial sense where you know that you are the one that's the agent empowering your own action into the so-called future, that authentic sense is the result of focused acting. We spoke of these contributions early on, and now I'm going to emphasize them because they lead to the fruits of self-transformation, which of course was the very first seminar we spoke of, where if we all are on the road to happiness, we are all looking for eudaimonia, that is the perfect harmonic blend of our psyche and our physique with the rest of the world, all in a very cosmically balanced situation of bliss. Eudaimonia is composed of an awakening mind, right, that leads to enlightenment. And we spoke of that earlier. When you're awakening the will, that will lead to empowerment. When you're awakening your feelings through your aesthetic sense, that's going to lead to endearment. And people and things will become very dear to you. In fact, even objects will take on that agapeic sense of endearment. And you'll find yourself appreciating your vehicle that you ride in, or the golf club you swing, in a whole new way. And then, of course, when you are awakening the power of life, that leads to emancipation. So, pretty well, these fruits of self-transformation are the result of cultivation. And the cultivation that we're going to do today is step number 3. And this is, as you know, the self-transformational evolving practice. All right, so for step 3, expanding one's 5 faculties, this is a self-transformational evolving practice. And here, it's our step 3. First of all, you're going to call yourself to purpose by using the awakening mantra to awaken your conscious being into self-awareness. I am conscious of being conscious. Second, you're going to transform your consciousness by doing one, several, or all of the following while engaged in activities during your daily life. First, you're going to be intuitively self-aware of your present experience. And thereby, you're going to contribute unity to the world by being so self-aware. Also, you're going to be mindful about what you're doing, feeling, thinking, and feeling. And that way, you're going to contribute truth to the world. Be appreciative and feel gratitude for what's come your way. Thereby, you'll contribute beauty to the world. And be focused in your engagement with the world, whether professionally or socially or even playfully. Whatever you're doing, be focused. That's going to lead to power, the release of power into the world. Be deliberate in your lifestyle's choices, associations, excursions, and daily regimen. Thereby, you're going to contribute goodness to the world. Just as the last session taught you Tilopa's technique for rest through his 6 words of advice for attuning to the peaceful center of consciousness, this technique today of expanding into the world consciously and with full awareness capitalizes on the momentum of the eternal moment for self-transformation. So, next time we're going to look at the foundation of these faculties as the basis of self-transformation. So, until next time, behave yourself when you must, be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself. And in understanding each of these terms, you're going to understand an aspect of the Trigonic self. Behaving when you must in the finite world regulates your empiric self. Being good whenever you can in the transfinite world of your awareness and faculties leads to felicity and happiness in your epistic self. And being yourself is a call to unleash your potential and consciously transform into your eudaimonic, Aeonic self.